So exciting to be here. I feel like there's like a bus of smartness just going by, like a new one comes every half hour. So I just want to say a couple of quick things and about myself, and just then sort of dive into this conversation. I'll be keeping this to about no more than 20 minutes, I promise. So one thing I wanted to note is that I'm in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. Prior to being here at NYU, I taught for 8 years at Haverford College, which is a small liberal arts college outside of Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. And as David said, my work is in the field of political theory. My training, my PhD is in political science, and my focus is on Latino politics and the politics of gender, politics of race and identity in the US. But now I'm in an interdisciplinary department, and I want to say a little bit about that because often people don't know what these interdisciplinary departments are, and you're coming to major and you're like, what is that? So just to note, social and cultural analysis, or SCA, in our department, we try to analyze the relationship between individuals, groups, institutions, governments, economics, and environments. Our PhD program is in American Studies, and our program draws on theories from a variety of fields: political science, history, English, anthropology, geography, feminism and queer theory, ethnic studies, critical race theory, labor studies, cultural studies, and metropolitan urban studies. So one reason I wanted to come here is to tell you, check us out. We are awesome. If you like a bunch of those things and you're not sure where you want to land, our department can be a home for a lot of that kind of thinking. So as David said, much of my research is focused on Latinos in the United States and thinking about how questions of conquest and colonialism exist alongside issues of immigration and migration. And thinking about the fact that for Latino communities in the US, Latinx communities, they are made up of both migrant and long-standing populations. So that's one sort of area of my research. But the other area of my research that I think is really important, I think for the purposes of today, is that I'm also a democratic theorist. And I'm also interested in exploring how questions of immigration and language are at their core debates about national identity, what kind of nation we are and we expect ourselves to be. So when we're debating things like immigration, we're not just discussing the right way to control the border, we're also trying to say something about how we understand the nature of membership and belonging. How do we understand the idea, for example, of political freedom? What is the relationship between human freedom and the ability to move? Right, to exit and enter various communities, spaces, and places. What are our expectations for living together as a collective? How do we understand the idea that we are self-governing, right, that we govern ourselves collectively? How do we engage with those who share the polity with us, right? What is our understanding of citizenship? I always ask my students, is citizenship something you have, a status, right? Or is citizenship something you do, a practice? Right? So those are the kinds of larger debates. So in that sense, while my focus is on specific communities, particularly Latino communities in the US, I want to think about how these communities tell us about how democratic life in this country works more generally. And how we imagine ourselves more broadly as a society. How do we think about ourselves? And I think this is true for multiple populations, for African Americans, Asian Americans, indigenous communities. So these are often conversations about what kind of nation we imagine ourselves to be. And so that's important to me. One thing I've been focusing on, and this is the purpose of today's talk, is I've been trying to understand why there's such a deep and intense and visceral hostility towards migrants today, right? Why is, for a specific segment of the population today, politicians, pundits, activists, et cetera, they are sort of incredibly hostile around those from Mexico and Latin America. And trying to understand why that's occurring, why they sort of why do these migrants produce such a feeling of rage and frustration, and why are these populations seen as a kind of existential threat to some Americans in terms of their own sovereignty or racial or cultural identity. Now, the growing intensity of nativist sentiment in American conservatism, and I should note this is a global phenomenon, we know. I'm focusing on the US in this talk. But this sort of intensity is made even more striking by the fact that actually overall, in terms of polling, immigrants in the US are generally viewed positively. And the issue of immigration ranks very low as a policy priority for most Americans. So the share of Americans calling, for example, for lower levels of immigration has fallen from a high of 65% in the mid-1990s to just 35% today, which is a record low. A Pew Research poll asking if immigrants strengthen the country with their hard work and talents found affirmative responses to that at an all-time high. Right? So at the same time, right, so that's sort of what interests me, is why on the one hand there's this segment that is incredibly intense about this issue and an overall population that is feeling pretty comfortable and excited and positive around immigration, right? What is the tension here? The other element of this that I want to think about is that Scholars and pollsters within political science have been arguing for some time that America is becoming increasingly polarized, with race, national identity, and immigration sharply dividing Democratic from Republican voters. In their 2017 book, White Backlash, Immigration, Race, and American Politics, for example, political scientist Marissa Abrajano, who I will note got her PhD here in politics at NYU, and Zoltan Hajnal reveal how the issue of immigration has been reshaping American politics. And they write, white Americans who harbor anti-immigrant sentiments are much more likely than others to identify as Republican and favor Republican candidates. Lee Drutman of the Democracy Fund Voters Study Group found that Trump's biggest enthusiasts within the party are Republicans who hold the most anti-immigrant and the most anti-Muslim views, demonstrate the most racial resentment, and are most likely to view Social Security and Medicare as important. White voters who favored deporting immigrants living in the country illegally were 3.3 times more likely to express a preference for Trump than those who did not. So in trying to make sense of this situation, it's my contention that one way we have to think about this question of why Latinx migrants are a site of such intense outrage requires a deeper appreciation of thinking about the politics of whiteness and white identity, or what Joel Olson, a political theorist, had referred to as the problem of what he calls white democracy. And what I'm going to talk to later is what another term was used was Herrenvolk Democracy. So here I want to explore the difference between whiteness versus white identity. When I speak of whiteness, I'm referring to an ideology, right? Whiteness is an ideology, not an identity. An ideology invested, well, it is also an identity, but an ideology, invested in the unequal distribution of power and privilege based on a racial hierarchy in which the standing of one section of the population is premised on the debasement of another. White identity, by contrast, has no biological or scientific foundation, and here I'm building off of a philosopher by the name of Linda Martina Alcoff, and her work in which she says white identity is best understood, as she puts it, as a historically evolving identity formation produced in diverse locations and continually undergoing reinterpretation and contestation. So one of my arguments in my research is that we are witnessing a growing rupture between white citizens who support the politics of whiteness and those white citizens increasingly appalled by the racist and racialized politics of white nativism, and that this divide within white communities and populations themselves represents an underappreciated aspect of political polarization today. In other words, I'm interested in how changing perceptions of whiteness among people who identify as white is sort of undergoing this shift. And I think we see every day in the US how white identity is increasingly in flux, more unstable and divided than in previous historical eras. One example I've often given is in 2016, you could go to a Trump rally and a Bernie Sanders rally and notice the fact that both were disproportionately white spaces. But whiteness meant something very different in those two kinds of spaces, right? So one thing I'm trying to sort of point to is the fact that white identity is in flux, and it is undergoing this kind of shift. Now, in saying that white identity is in flux, I don't want to ignore or downplay the implications of the ongoing shift in aggregate white partisanship. Trump received an extremely high portion of the white vote, and he was elected in 2016 because of the white vote, right? And we have to reckon with that as a people. The majority of white men and women, 58%, voted for Republican Donald Trump, while only 37% of whites voted for Democrat Hillary Clinton. Overall, white women voted 53% for Trump, 43% for Clinton. The only group of white voters Clinton won were white college-educated women, and she won them by a bare majority, 51%. Clinton lost with white men with college degrees, as well as white men without college degrees. She lost with white women without college degrees, 62 to 34%, right? So that's one part of the story. At the same time, while the majority of non-white voters in this country are Democrats, another aspect of my research has noted that a not insignificant minority of Latinos and other people of color also identify as Republican, and many of those supporters supported Donald Trump. Right? He got something like between 27 and 29% of the Latino vote in 2016, for example. So clearly we're seeing complex racial dynamics in both parties. Nevertheless, my claim is that one of the most intriguing features about our current politics is how white identity is pulling in different directions. So for example, while there has been, in one sense, a defection of whites from the Democratic to the Republican Party starting in the 1960s and 70s, which a number of scholars have written about, those white voters who continue to identify as Democrats are becoming increasingly liberal regarding questions of racism and racial justice. A recent report by the think tank Data Progress declared that, quote, we're witnessing a historically unprecedented shift in opinions about race among white Democratic voters. White Democrats, quote, increasingly reject racism and have become, quote, much less likely to endorse individualistic explanations of racial inequality and are more supportive of structural explanations for racial inequality, right? So the good news here is that the ability of white nativists on the right to engage in aggressive forms of what we might want to call white identity politics and anti-immigrant nativism is threatened today. And it's threatened not only by the growth of America's non-white population, but also by the changing nature of white identity itself. Right? So white nativists feel under threat not only by the presence of immigrants and people of color, but also by the growing number of white liberals and progressives also expressing anti-racist sentiments. Right? So this population is now feeling sort of persecuted and sort of under assault, but in a variety of directions. And it's important to understand that. So what I want to suggest is that when we want to think about this question of how anti-migrant and anti-Latino politics occurs, we need to go back and think about this historically. We need to kind of develop what I'm talking about as kind of a genealogy of whiteness, right? And one important way to get there, I think is really critical, is thinking about the history of Jim Crow and the legacies of segregation and slavery, and the politics of what that meant, and how it allows us to understand how some people can still be attached to a politics of whiteness, what Olson refers to as the idea of whiteness as standing. And so my claim is in a way to think about the kind of racial transpositions that have been occurring over the past period of, maybe 60 years or so. And that one of my claims is that to understand the treatment of Latinos migrants today, requires us to kind of think about this question of white state making and the sort of different political satisfactions that emerge from certain kinds of practices. And one of them is thinking about the political satisfaction that we have some citizens getting, the political satisfaction of being a white subject, protected by individual rights and the rule of law, but having the freedom to partake in the arbitrary exercise of power against those deemed white, non-white, right? Against those deemed non-white. That was actually the experience of Jim Crow and slavery, right? Historically, you could do this to certain populations, in particular African Americans. And this has been often characterized by some scholars as what they call Herrenvolk Democracy, the term meaning a regime that is, quote, democratic for the master race, but tyrannical for subordinate groups. And as Olson notes, this form of American democracy was in many ways America's form of democracy until 1965 and the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, right? That we had certain kind of racial stratifications that were not rendered illegal until that time in a kind of generalized sense. A central claim of my work is that the undocumented today, non-citizens in general, represent the rare population that can still be subject to Herrenvolk rules, that migrants today can still be a population that can experience state-sanctioned practices of violence, enforcement, terror, exclusion, and removal, witnessed and enacted by a government that can legitimately claim its actions have democratic approval, are lawfully necessary and authorized. Key to this peculiar quality of Herrenvolk democracy is that white citizens at that time ruled themselves democratically while imposing tyranny on others. Jim Crow, for me, is a powerful example of the Herrenvolk practice of white citizens making laws that gave them the legal right to decide whether, how, and on whom laws would be enforced, while also targeting black populations excluded from making the laws they were being ruled by. Here we have to be attentive, I think, to the emotional power of being ruled over others, right? The power of being free by ruling over others, of having the ability to invoke legality in the service of domination. And so I think the dynamic power we see in that sometimes is when we think about segregation. And we often think about segregation in terms of white or colored, we think about white or colored drinking fountains or restrooms, right? Those practices of self-sorting were obviously troubling. But one point I want to make is that both these examples obscure the role that white citizens at the time played in the daily creation of segregated space. As C. Van Woodard notes in The Strange Career of Jim Crow, he writes, Jim Crow laws, quote, put the authority of the state or the city in the voice of the streetcar conductor, the railway brakeman, the bus driver, the theater usher, and also in the voice of the hoodlum of the public parks and playgrounds. They gave free rein and majesty of the law to mass aggressions that might otherwise have been curbed, blunted, or deflected. Legislated by white elected officials, but enforced by a wide cross-section of white citizens, white waiters, waitresses, realtors, hospital workers, librarians, ushers, lifeguards, landlords, hotel clerks. One of the most gratifying elements of Jim Crow was the power, authority, opportunity, and freedom it gave ordinary white citizens to personally police and punish the spaces of African Americans and the spaces they sought to inhabit. In Jim Crow, we're reminded that Herrenvolk Democracy was a mass-based, participatory endeavor, reproduced and administered from below and above. And some of the work I look at, for example, as I conclude here, involves looking at work by folks like W.E.B. Du Bois and his work on Black Reconstruction, looking at Ida B. Wells and her work on mob violence in New Orleans. And I'm trying to think about this by putting it in conversation with work on Mexican-American and anti-Mexican politics historically, which I can talk a little about in the Q&A. But the last point I want to make about this, if sort of one last point I want to leave you with this talk, is it's important to understand, I believe, that when we talk about racism, we're not talking about simply bias or interpersonal dynamics. As a political theorist, as a democratic theorist, I want to think about racism as having a political history as a form of authoritarianism. Racism isn't distinct from the rise of authoritarianism in the US right now. It's a practice of authoritarianism. It's the rule of authoritarianism made flesh, and it's embedded in our practices of democracy. Right, so I think theorizing whiteness allows us to see how what is often today being called things like norm erosion in the Trump administration might be best understood as an impulse towards authoritarian or tyrannical practices that have their roots in an American political history, and that these authoritarian practices are now being applied to various populations, right, including sometimes white citizens who have not experienced themselves under authoritarian rule, whereby African American, Native populations, Mexican populations have already had the political experience of being denied justice in the courts, not having their votes counted fairly, or being denied equal representation. Today, the erosion of democratic norms, I would argue, is a legacy of Herrenvolk democracy. It's been part of our political legacy since the American founding, and it's a legacy that I think we have yet to fully grapple with. So, thanks. Thank you.